On August 2, 1589, the Château de Saint Cloud on the outskirts of Paris becomes the stage for one of the most controversial deaths in French history. Henry III, the last king of the Valois dynasty, lies dying in his bed after being stabbed by a fanatical monk. But this is no ordinary king meeting his end. This is the man who shocked all of Europe with his feminine habits, who dressed in jewels and perfumes, and who transformed the French court into the center of the greatest scandals of royal behavior ever recorded. At 37 years old, Henry is paying the price for a lifetime of controversies. His final words are not about God or his kingdom, but about his beloved mignons, the young favorites who accompanied him throughout his scandalous reign. Thus ends the life of France's most controversial king, a monarch whose identity confused chroniclers of his time and continues to intrigue historians to this day. How did Henry III become the symbol of everything that 16th century society considered inappropriate for a king? Why was his court whispered about throughout Europe as a place of indescribable practices? To understand the forbidden history of this extraordinary monarch, we must return to the beginning and discover the secrets he hid behind the French crown. Henry was born on September 19, 1551, the third son of Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. From childhood, he demonstrated characteristics that deeply worried the French court. While his brothers played with swords and horses, Henry preferred dolls and games considered feminine. His mother, the powerful Catherine de' Medici, desperately tried to correct these behaviors, but without success. During his adolescence, Henry developed an obsession with fashion, cosmetics, and jewelry that was completely uncommon for a prince of that era. He spent hours grooming himself in front of mirrors, experimenting with different hairstyles and applying imported powders and perfumes. His tutors reported with concern that the young prince seemed more interested in the ladies' clothing at court than in learning about war and politics. His education was carefully supervised by Catherine de' Medici, who hoped to transform her son into a traditional king. Henry was forced to participate in tournaments, hunts, and military exercises, but always showed more interest in ceremonial attire than in the activities themselves. Chroniclers of the time describe how he would arrive at hunting events wearing more jewelry than many queens. The first major public controversy came when Henry was 16 years old. During a court ball, he appeared wearing an outfit that mixed masculine and feminine elements so boldly that it caused immediate scandal. The young prince wore a bodice embroidered with pearls, puffy skirts beneath a masculine doublet, and a diamond necklace that belonged to his mother. The French nobility was shocked. Catherine de' Medici, realizing she needed to take drastic measures, decided to send Henry to Poland in 1573, where he had been elected king. She hoped that royal responsibility and distance from Paris might cure her son's strange habits, but the strategy had the opposite effect. Away from maternal supervision, Henry intensified his controversial behaviors. During his brief reign in Poland, Henry scandalized the austere Polish nobility with his excesses of vanity. He transformed his court in Krakow into a spectacle of feminine luxury that left European diplomats astonished. He received ambassadors while wearing ornate dresses, tiaras studded with precious stones, and elaborate makeup that took hours to apply. Henry's habits in Poland became legendary throughout Europe. He insisted on taking perfumed baths daily, something considered dangerous and feminine at the time, and maintained an army of servants specialized solely in caring for his appearance. His collection of dresses rivaled that of any European queen, and he went so far as to commission special jewelry from Venice just to complement his outfits. When his brother Charles IX died in 1574, Henry secretly abandoned Poland during the early morning hours to return to France and assume the French throne. His escape was as feminine as everything else in his life. He traveled disguised as an Italian noblewoman, wearing veils and complete feminine clothing throughout the entire journey back to Paris. Henry III's coronation as King of France was an unprecedented spectacle. He insisted on using a specially modified crown that would accommodate his elaborate feminine hairstyle. His coronation robe was embroidered with pearls and precious stones, in an arrangement that imitated the dresses of previous queens. The event so scandalized the French nobility that many nobles refused to attend. Once established as King of France, Henry began implementing changes in the court that shocked all of Europe. He instituted new etiquette protocols based on feminine courts, where courtiers were obliged to treat matters of fashion and beauty with the same seriousness as affairs of state. Royal Council meetings frequently included discussions about the latest trends in hairstyles and cosmetics. The most controversial aspect of Henry's reign were his mignons, extremely beautiful young courtiers, whom he kept around him constantly. These favorites received titles, lands, and privileges that generated envy and suspicion throughout the court. The mignons dressed even more extravagantly than the king himself, creating a subculture of alternative masculinity that challenged all social conventions of the time. The three most famous mignons were Anne d'Arques, Jean-Louis de Nogaret, and François d'Espinay, all of whom received duchies and important positions in government, despite being very young and without political experience. They accompanied Henry in all activities, slept in chambers near the king, and participated in beauty rituals that lasted for hours. The relationship between Henry and his favorites was the subject of constant speculation throughout Europe. Joyeuse in particular became a figure almost as controversial as the king himself. Henry spent an astronomical fortune on Joyeuse's wedding, creating a ceremony that rivaled royal weddings in splendor. The king personally supervised every detail of the celebration, from floral arrangements to guests' attire, behaving more like an obsessive hostess than a monarch. Henry's expenses on fashion and beauty were so exorbitant that they contributed significantly to France's financial crisis. He maintained an army of tailors, jewelers, perfumers, and cosmetic specialists. His outfits were so elaborate that they frequently cost more than the annual budget of small French cities. Each public appearance required a completely new wardrobe. Henry's obsession with his appearance reached absurd extremes. He spent at least 4 hours daily grooming himself, a process that included perfumed baths, application of multiple layers of makeup, elaborate hairstyles, and careful selection of jewelry. He kept a detailed diary of his outfits, noting each combination to never repeat the same appearance in public. During religious events, Henry caused particular scandal. He participated in religious processions wearing modified habits that looked more like ornate feminine dresses than appropriate clothing for devotion. His participation in Catholic ceremonies became so controversial that many bishops refused to officiate masses in his presence. France's religious situation became dramatically complicated during Henry's reign. The wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants intensified, and many saw the king's inappropriate behavior as a sign of the moral decadence plaguing the kingdom. Fanatical preachers used Henry's figure as an example of what happened when traditional morality was abandoned. The Catholic League, led by Henry de Guise, constantly used the king's feminine behavior as propaganda against the monarchy. Pamphlets circulated through Paris, describing Henry as a king who had abandoned his masculinity and therefore did not deserve to rule Christian France. These defamation campaigns contributed significantly to the kingdom's political instability. Henry tried to counterbalance criticism through public demonstrations of religious piety, but even his devotional practices were considered excessively feminine. He created a personal religious order called the Order of the Holy Spirit, whose ceremonies included rituals that seemed more like theatrical performances than acts of genuine faith. Henry's private life was the subject of constant speculation. Although he married Louise of Lorraine in 1575, the marriage was clearly political and never resulted in children. Louise was a pious and withdrawn woman who seemed to serve more as social cover than as a true wife. She rarely appeared in public alongside her husband and lived practically as a recluse in the palace. The lack of direct heirs created a dynastic crisis that was aggravated by the king's controversial behavior. French succession was threatened, and Henry's political enemies used his apparent lack of interest in women as evidence that he was incapable of producing the heir that France desperately needed. During the decade of the 1580s, France's political situation deteriorated rapidly. The wars of religion reached their peak of violence, and Henry found himself increasingly politically isolated. His insistence on maintaining his feminine habits, even during grave national crises, was seen as proof of his inadequacy for the throne. The breaking point came in 1588, when Henry was forced to flee Paris during the Day of the Barricades. Even during this humiliating escape, he insisted on taking with him several trunks containing his most precious outfits and his jewelry collection. His priority with appearance, even in moments of mortal danger, was seen as final proof of his frivolity. In his final months of life, Henry became increasingly isolated and paranoid. His minions had died in duels or distanced themselves out of fear, and he found himself surrounded only by opportunistic courtiers. Still, he obsessively maintained his beauty rituals, as if maintaining his appearance could somehow restore his lost authority. Henry's death at the hands of Jacques Clement, a fanatical Dominican monk, on August 2, 1589, ended not only his life but the entire Valois dynasty. His final words, whispered about his beloved dead mignons, revealed where his true affections lay until the end. Henry III's legacy remains one of the most complex and controversial in French history. He was simultaneously a refined patron of the arts, a skillful politician at crucial moments, and a figure who challenged all conventions of royal masculinity of his era. His court produced some of the greatest cultural advances of the French Renaissance, but also scandalized an entire generation of Europeans. Modern historians debate intensely about the true nature of Henry III. Some see him as a man ahead of his time who challenged rigid gender norms in an intolerant age. Others argue that his excesses contributed to the instability that would eventually lead to the fall of the French monarchy. What remains indisputable is that Henry III was one of the most unique kings in European history. He proved that even in the rigid world of 16th century monarchy, it was possible to live according to one's own identity, even if it cost the throne and life itself. His story continues to fascinate and shock more than 400 years after his tragic death.